That's not the word. Well, so let me go ahead and get us started. And I know the tendency, John, once you've corrected a certain number of papers, you can't look at a misspelled word and not correct, right? Yes. So I hope, kidding aside, to conclude this lecture series today. On which note, let me jump in and sprint through a little bit of review. If there's one diagram, it seems to me that you would want seared in your mind from the material that we've been discussing together for a couple months now, it's this diagram, which says, right, that the electorate that supports the Democratic Party looks very much like the demographics of the United States today. The electorate of the Republican Party looks the way America looked 60 years ago. And for that reason, the Republicans are dealing with a shrinking base. White Americans continue to vote for Democrats and Republicans, and there's somebody just said participants can now see my application. I assume that must mean the slide share.
We can see it. We can see it, David.
Okay. All right. Okay. I've never seen that message from Zoom before. Whereas the right share of the population that Republicans are competing for is shrinking, the share of the population, people of color, non-whites, that votes dominantly Democratic is growing and will continue to grow. And this means, of course, that the Republicans are in certain respects turning against democracy, against elections, against the rule of law, against the idea that we settle the question of who our leaders are going to be and what policies are going to govern us by determining it through a free and fair vote. And as opposed to that, those Republicans who are uncomfortable with the diversification of America are increasingly souring on democracy as such, at least to the extent that it means extending equal rights and fair opportunity to rule to new and diverse citizens. And some new data actually came in on this from the Pew Center very recently. Polls conducted just last month. And among other things, this shows that there's been a pretty dramatic shift in the Republican attitude to voting, that it's no longer regarded as a fundamental or basic right of citizenship, regarded more as a privilege. As you can see, while the majority of Americans regard voting as a fundamental right, nearly 2/3, really more than 2/3 of Republicans regard voting as a privilege, whereas more than 3/4 of Democrats regard voting as a basic and essential right. And this then leads to other differences in the partisan understanding of the exercise of citizens' rights and what is important and what is a threat. If we look at the question of whether or not people who are not legally qualified to vote are prevented from voting, we see that there's a very strong preponderance of Republicans who think that it's important to prevent those who are not qualified from voting, and very little confidence that this is actually done. Whereas for Democrats, they also think that it's important, but they are mainly confident that it's done. And if we were to want this opinion to be grounded in the data, we would want us to be nearly 100% confident that only those who are legally qualified to vote, given that there is absolutely minuscule instances of illegal voting or voting fraud in this country in every election on record over the last 50 years. So people who are legally qualified and want to vote being able to cast a ballot, how important is that? And again, you can see that Republicans think it's important, but they're very confident that it's happening already, whereas Democrats are much more concerned about voter suppression or obstacles to voting for those who are legally qualified. And so again, just the jumping off place for repairing our partisan discord in our democracy is recognizing that we have very different opinions about democracy, how it operates, and what threatens it in 2021 based on the party that we belong to. This then is driving efforts to suppress or restrict access to the ballot. And as you can see, as you've seen, these are almost exclusively sponsored by Republicans. They're almost exclusively going to succeed in states controlled by Republicans. It's back in the news today, of course, because Governor Abbott of Texas has called another special session of the legislature to try to get this legislation passed, while the Democratic members of the state legislature of Texas are in Washington, D.C., holed up there to deprive their Republican colleagues of a quorum so that they can pass this legislation. They're also there trying to bring pressure to bear on members of Congress to pass new voting rights legislation. And I think it's worthwhile noting that today is the anniversary, the precise day on which the original Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. And so we're at the 56th anniversary of that piece of legislation today. And it does appear that there's some snail's pace of progress on new voting right legislation in the Senate. Whether it has any prospects of passing, it's very difficult for me to see the way clear, but it does appear that Joe Manchin is increasingly on board with this legislation. Of course, for it to pass, it's almost certain that the Senate would have to suspend the filibuster on this piece of legislation. And that's where Manchin and Kristen Sinema seem not to get on board. So let me then finally summarize what it is that I've been arguing with you for these many lectures about the psychological roots of polarization and its consequences for our politics. And the first is that we're in an era of political competition where the parties are increasingly aligned in terms of political psychology, the political psychology of their voters and their leaders. There are people who believe that the kinds and rate of change that the United States is undergoing, and it's of course not just us, whether we're talking about technological change, economic change, demographic change, cultural change, change in values, we are in a period of rapid transformation. And there are people who say, well, that's good. We're excited by the new prospects. We're benefiting from these changes. Maybe we even regard the old order as unjust, unfair, discriminatory, and it's a good thing that those norms and laws are losing their power over us. And then there are other people for whom the rate and nature of the change that we're undergoing appears to be very fast and threatening, disorienting, and really, in fact, unjust, unfair, overwhelming. And so those kinds of people are now primarily represented by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has in many ways transformed from being a conservative movement party, the party of Ronald Reagan, into being a party of authority that aims to have the power, primarily concentrated in the president, to slow or halt the rate of change in our society, in its racial composition, in its gender norms, in its forms of sexuality, as well as in its economy, perhaps. And that these are issues that do not allow for easy compromise. This is about the direction of the country and who belongs and doesn't belong. This is issues then of fundamental identity and justice that don't allow easy compromise. In addition to that factor, a second independent psychological factor is that our partisan identity increasingly signals an entire cluster of identities that include not just ideology, but psychology, religiosity, race, geography, etc. And that under, therefore, the banner of partisanship, there's this tendency to think of it primarily as an identity, not as an ideology or a policy preference. And again, this tends then to sort us into in groups and out groups, political tribes, and to accentuate and encourage the tendency for groupthink. My side has all the right answers, or if not that, at least the other side is totally misguided and, in fact, quite evil in its intent. And therefore, I don't even need to listen to them, let alone to hear them, to take into account their arguments, to modify my position when they make a good point. And hence, democracy increasingly is stripped of what I think of as its core rationality, that which emerges from deliberation, from the need to listen to others with whom we disagree, and to learn from them when our views are one-sided or mistaken. The result of all this is that we're not disagreeing with our fellow citizens and then choosing our party based on the one that best aligns with our pre-existing views on policy or ideology. We are marking our belonging to a political identity and then aligning ourselves on the policy positions according to what our party leaders tell us is the marker of that identity. And so identity is driving our politics, partisan identity that makes us hostile. It also makes us increasingly irrational in many ways of thinking about it. We pay less attention to our material interests as opposed to our expressive interests, making sure that our side wins, as opposed to asking whether its policies are good for me or not. And that this then can give rise to what Henri Tajfel calls a relentless spiral of rational and irrational forms of group conflicts, right? The one group does something to the other group demands its revenge, and then the first group is wounded and escalates the disagreement and conflict. And this then triggers fundamental aspects of our social and political psychology, deep structures in our brain that lead us to compete with the other group, to withhold cooperation from the other group, to display loyalty to our group. Again, it's a destructive form of politics. And we add into that, and of course, it's not an additional and separate factor, it's a core constituent of this whole dynamic, that our information system has completely transformed over the last 50 years, with many more outlets, with ordinary people generating a great deal of content, with much of that content geared not to furnishing objective, impartial, verified knowledge and information, but instead confirming those who consume it in their sense that they are exclusively right, that people like them are the good people, and those who disagree are bad, right? And so we have a political system and an information system that are reinforcing each other in generating these profound psychological divisions in our politics. And I want to say, in these circumstances, in this circumstance, politics and information make us stupid, right? The information we get is so slanted, so one-sided. Our political loyalty is so unquestioning, so prone to groupthink, that yes, it feels like we're digesting a lot of information, we're getting a lot of knowledge, we are understanding a lot about our candidates and our political positions, but in fact, this is all biased or motivated reasoning. It's all an effort on the part of us to show that our side is right and the other side is wrong. And that's almost always a distorted way of thinking. This is then manifest in our elections, where we no longer try to persuade anyone in the middle, just to rile up our own troops by getting them scared of the other side. And this is also reflected in the fact, as partisanship grows strong with rank and file voters, it weakens parties. And let me give you an illustration from today's news, and it's where I'll shift to in just a moment. A significant portion of Republican leaders at the state level, I think, are beginning to become frightened of the position that they have staked out vis-a-vis the coronavirus, masking, social distancing, closing businesses, and distributing and mandating vaccination. And the position they've been in, of course, is one of being skeptical about all of those measures, of being libertarian and indicating that individuals have the liberty to make up their minds on whether or not to wear a mask or take a vaccine or go to a restaurant, that government should not be telling them what to do. And the result, of course, is that the virus is rampant in those states led by those governors. And one way of correlating this is by looking at Trump support. And of course, it's not Trump himself. And this is where I'm going with this. It's not being led in this instance by the putative leader of the Republican Party. He, of course, was at the helm when his administration developed the vaccine. He has somewhat half-heartedly encouraged people to get the vaccine, but members of his party remain skeptical of the vaccine. And I think for many of the reasons that Donald Trump cultivated and mobilized, a general skepticism of elite expertise as being hostile to, foreign to the ordinary man or woman lived experience, that we should disregard those liberal elites and just trust our own hunches, intuition, judgment.
That's the norm now.
Yeah. And I can't tell, are you asking a question or making a comment? No. Okay. And so some of the background noises.
September.
Okay, I'm just going to hit mute real quick. And please remember, you can unmute yourselves whenever you want. Just hit the space bar or the little microphone icon. So what we're seeing, I think, on the part of some Republican leaders is a recognition, if our policies and our rhetoric lead our supporters to perish or their loved ones to become gravely ill, they are going to blame us. And so we need to figure out a way out of this position. And I think we're seeing this in media figures as well. What we're seeing, however, is apparently that some of the people in the party, some of the people who have bought into the idea that this is just the flu, or that the vaccines are more dangerous than the virus itself, some of the total and utter nonsense that circulates very widely in certain sectors of our information system and in our political discourse these days, that's dangerous. They want to dial it back, but they're having a hard time persuading their followers. Their partisan identity is aligned with the idea, because they mistrust elites, because they want to display themselves as masculine, because they don't want to give any credence to something a Democratic president is urging them to do, they're not going along. And so this is a classic example of politics spiraling out of control. You start something, but you don't know exactly where it's going to end. Once you start it, you relinquish control of forces that gain momentum and dynamic of their own. This is happening to the Republican Party with COVID right now. This is threatening all of us. This is as clear an illustration of the pathology of partisanship in 21st century America as we could ask for. So what to do about it? We looked last week at Ezra Klein's recommendations, 3 categories of recommendations. The first is being self-critical, recognizing when we are letting partisanship drive our cognition as opposed to thinking things through slowly, scrutinizing ourselves and criticizing ourselves, being suspicious when we think everything we say is right, and especially when we think everything they say is wrong. Try to redistribute our sympathy to make ourselves a little bit less partisan, a little bit more impartial. His second big recommendation, which in a sense acknowledges that the first approach is not going to succeed quickly, is to bomb-proof our politics, to try to take stuff that is currently capable of being held hostage to partisan polarization and that could do tremendous damage to the American and world economy. Budgeting and debt ceiling are the big examples here. Try to take them out of the ordinary legislative process, which has become so paralyzed, and put them on automatic tracks where if you want to prevent the debt ceiling from rising, you have to sponsor legislation and get it passed, as opposed to having to pass new legislation every time the debt ceiling needs to rise to cover the costs of legislation that you have already passed. Third, and finally, and this is, I think, very much in line with Ezra Klein's analysis, if what's driving polarization in our society is structural and systemic, it's not individual choices. If the polarization is asymmetrical, it affects the Republican Party much more than the Democratic Party. But if over time, the escalating radicalism of the Republican Party will push the Democratic Party in a mirror image opposite direction, then we need to remove the forces, the structures that are driving radicalization of the Republican Party. And as Klein suggests, the best way to do that is to create new electoral incentives for the Republican Party to have to appeal to a genuine popular majority of the electorate, especially in presidential, but also in congressional elections. And we went through his list of recommendations that we bypass the Electoral College, that we change the nature of congressional districting. Of course, you probably saw that next week, the census data, the more fine-grained data will be released, and with it, the redistricting process will begin, and we can expect a whole new round of partisan gerrymandering, especially in Republican states. These are, if you remember the vocabulary, anti-competitive strategies. The Republicans don't think they can win a popular majority simply by continuing their current politics. They don't think they can reform their politics to appeal to a broader majority without risking their base. And so they're trying to make it more difficult for ordinary Democrats to vote. They're trying to make it such that the limited number of votes they can rely on punch above their weight, deliver more offices to them than the proportion of the population that supports them Of course, gerrymandering, partisan redistricting is one of the main ways to do this. If we could pass legislation that made it more difficult, if we could encourage states to adopt multi-member districts, this would give oxygen to more moderate candidates, de-emphasize the primary, create more genuine majoritarian competition at the state level, and give moderate Republicans a fighting chance within the 21st century Republican Party. Eliminate the filibuster, which is a institution that further amplifies the power of the electoral minority to hold the majority's politics hostage, to simply veto or defeat them. It is not doing its work of fostering bipartisanship and compromise anymore. It has become a mere instrument of obstruction that allows roughly 20% of the population to block what the other 80% want to do. It should go, Ezra Klein suggests, and as you might guess, I certainly agree with him, when it's perhaps the only way that we're going to get meaningful voting right and voting reform legislation passed. Give statehood to Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico to further diversify the constituents who elect the senators, to try to counteract some of the Republican advantage in less populous, less homogeneous states. Finally, to protect voting rights by limiting gerrymandering and making various obstacles illegal. I think that Klein is exactly right, that doing all of this would force the Republican Party to reform itself. But of course, we have a chicken and egg problem here, which is to say, why would the Republican Party support any of this legislation? And if the Republican Party doesn't support this legislation, how can it possibly be passed, given that the filibuster is still in place, given that we're out to redistrict again, and that we're very likely to see still more aggressive gerrymandering, given that we know that 17 states have passed draconian restrictions on access to ballots, efforts to change the way in which the vote is counted and tallied and registered and transmitted to allow for more partisan influence. This is not a climate in which these reforms have any realistic chance of being passed. And so we are in a escalating spiral at the moment. And simply being able to point to policy that would get us out of that spiral is insufficient if that policy cannot be passed until we break the hold of the spiral. And so this leads me to get past Klein's analysis and to begin looking at other sources, other propositions, other ideas for reform. I want to start by circling back to the middle of the 20th century, when American political science was in love with political parties, thought that if anything, they should be more ideological, more different from each other, when Schachtschneider famously said modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties. And we thought then that parties performed a number of functions. They facilitated communication between elites and ordinary citizens. They allowed ordinary citizens an opportunity to participate in politics and forced politicians to listen to them. They socialized citizens and leaders alike into the basic norms of constitutional democracy: fidelity to the outcome of elections, encouraging people to vote, etc. And that they were institutions that not only mobilized citizens, got them to the polls, encouraged them to vote, encouraged participation, again, ironic in light of what's happening now, but also made political choice tractable, manageable, prevented cognitive overload from overwhelming citizens with the complexity of issues by simplifying them and packaging them, bundling them into neat packages for citizens to choose between. And finally, they made accountability possible, right? You knew who to blame, not just individually, but in terms of the party. And one of the questions is, how could we get back to parties that are more like the mid 20th century political parties that had these virtues? And I'm going to start off then looking at some contemporary literature on reforming parties themselves. And I'm going to introduce a few different books. I'm going to do this relatively quickly. The first and the really, I think, most comprehensive and impressive is by Nancy Rosenblum, the chair of the government department at Harvard University, who's On the Side of Angels, is a 600-page history of the animosity, the antagonism to parties in the history of political theory, and then an account to, if you will, rehabilitate political parties from the perspective of democratic theory, to ask what constructive functions they can play and how we might enhance those constructive functions. This book is about a decade old, and I think it, in a sense, predates some of the worst aspects of polarization, but nevertheless, I think the ideas are good and important. Then there's Russell Muirhead of Dartmouth College, who in his book, The Promise of Party in a Polarized Age, introduces this concept of high partisanship, which I started the lecture series with, of a common good party. The idea that if we confine partisanship to the right institutions, he thinks it's primarily a creature of the legislature, that when it starts to infect the courts or administrative agencies, we're in trouble. But when it is confined primarily to the legislature and takes a higher form, it's actually very good for democracy and good for citizenship. And then Francis Rosenbluth and Ian Shapiro of Yale have this book that's just out this year, Responsible Parties Saving Democracy from Itself, about the importance of parties as an intermediary institution in an age of populism, and an age in which people seem to want to bypass intermediary institutions, make their own media content, make their own policies, make their own judgments. How can we strengthen parties in 2021? Let me offer a overview of some of their recommendations. And one of the first and most important recommendations is to prioritize partisanship over parties, to try to make citizens' ethics the source of discipline for political parties, to make parties carry, responsive to, in other words, the kind of partisanship that ethical citizens display. And this is one of Rosenblum's central claims, that what we need to be thinking about before we think about political parties is partisans. How is it that the people who are supporting the party shape, discipline, punish if necessary the party so that it stays to the high road, does good work? And the claim then, to put it in simple terms, is under the right circumstances, high partisanship produces common good parties. And when I look at this, as well as Russ Muirhead's work, which takes a very similar position. I think one of the things to see is that the idea here is that ethical reform of individual voters has the power to change party dynamics, that whether it's the ethics of leaders who refuse populism and don't simply kowtow to the donor with the most money, or especially citizens who are able to withdraw support from parties if parties do not manifest high partisanship and prioritize the common good over narrow strategic advantage. And the question is, if you've got leaders who have some ethics, if you've got citizens who demand ethics of their leaders, is that going to be enough to produce good parties? And to be clear, Rosenblum and Muirhead have suggestions for strengthening high partisanship, among them trying to have genuine campaign finance reform so that individual candidates are less beholden to donors whose interests are often not identical to the common good. I suppose it doesn't really need to be said. And even more importantly, perhaps, subsidizing the party itself. Political parties are expensive to operate, especially in the age of media-driven campaigns. We can see this in the data. The amount that's being spent on campaigns is doubling each decade for the last few decades. And so as campaigns become more expensive, parties, if they are not publicly subsidized, become more and more beholden to private donors. And the result is that they do their bidding and are less responsive to citizens, ethical or otherwise. And the claim then is that there are reforms that we could put in place that would allow ethical citizens to have greater power to demand ethical conduct from their parties. Now, if this were done, these accounts argue that political parties would continue to be indispensable to modern democracy, play some absolutely critical roles. Among them, we can start with Madison's very old idea from Federalist Number 10 from the 1780s, right? That when parties select far-sighted statespeople to lead their faction and the country, then those statesmen will enlarge and refine the public's view of its good. And the result is that public policy will be more consonant with the public good than if it were directly produced by the public itself. And again, if we had parties that gave us Madison's or Jefferson's, etc., for our leaders, then maybe we could actually think that that would be the case. But of course, in 2016, the Republican Party gave us Donald Trump as our president. And so it's a little hard to envision the kind of transformation in citizens' ethics that would lead parties to continue, or to resume, I should say, playing this refining and enlarging role. So we have a second argument in what we've studied together, and that's Daniel Ziblatt's argument from conservative parties in the birth of democracy, which is that parties with strong professionalized strata moderate extreme leaders and prevent them from feeling moral panic. They diffuse pragmatism and keep insurgent groups from gaining power in democracy. And again, I think that this is a persuasive argument about Europe in the 19th and early 20th century and what differentiates those societies that successfully consolidated democracy from those that went up and down with authoritarianism and fascism, and all of the destruction and violation of human rights that those regimes carried with them. But having said all of that, one of the things that we've learned in this course is that strong partisanship weakens political parties, right? And so in the context of 2021, in post-persuasion elections, when the way in which you win is not by convincing those who have not made up their minds to embrace your candidate and the policies in their platform, but instead by vilifying the other side and making your side feel fear and anger about the possibility that somebody that vile could be elected. That's not going to leave much room for professionals to moderate the extremism that seems to be catnip in contemporary electoral politics. We've looked at Lincoln's Republicans and seen an exemplary common good party. We know such a thing can exist, but I think another lesson we should draw from Heather Cox Richardson's important work is about the half-life of such a party. How easily and quickly were the Republicans captured and turned into the party of big business as opposed to a genuine common good party with an inclusive egalitarian vision of the political economy, of a democratic political economy. This suggests, again, absent really strong public support for the parties, that the parties are likely to be corrupted very quickly, even if they do hit a high moment of high partisanship. So returning now to Rosenblum in this context, she suggests that when we look at the constructive work that good political parties do, that high partisanship does, that political parties are actually extremely important in creating political interests and opinions, formulating issues, and drawing the lines of division in normal politics in a democracy. And so to be clear, right, Lincoln reorganized the question about slavery from being one of abolition because slavery was intrinsically evil to the enslaved, to being one about containing the spread of slavery because slave power is not only so violative of the rights and persons of those enslaved, but also a form of oligarchy that is incompatible with democracy, given the power that it gives to slave owners, right? And so this then is suggestive of the way in which a political party can actually realign voters' ideas, opinions, and that we need to be sensitive to the fact that there's an autonomy to democratic politics if political parties are playing this role, that it's not always the case that our pre-existing political cleavages and interests, or I should say social cleavages, are permanent and fixed. And again, one of the things I think, trying to extend Rosenblum's analysis into the present, she might hope, is that we will get a new alignment in our politics when a new leader for the Republican Party appreciates that we need and will benefit from a different way of aligning our politics, not simply protecting a nostalgic, falsified view of how great America was when it was largely white and subject to a less technological, more traditional economy, society, religion, etc. That this is, in a sense, the great misfortune of the United States in the last 5 years, that the charismatic leader that emerged for the Republican Party was not someone like John McCain, but instead someone like Donald Trump. But that doesn't mean that this has to be the case, that we may not have found them yet, but that there may be waiting in the wings a new leader for the Republican Party, new forces and dynamics that will realign and reconstitute democratic politics, change our cleavages and divisions for the middle of the 21st century. Fourth account is from Rosenbluth and Shapiro, and it's very similar to Nancy Rosenblum's account, the idea that political parties are bundlers and aggregators, that they generate coherent policy proposals and cognitively manageable choices. That should be very familiar to us, right? That's what we've been studying, going all the way back to Daniel Zablat. But what Rosenbluth and Shapiro add is that we've come too far down the path of democratizing the functions that political parties used to play. They're particularly focused on popular primaries, which prevent the political party from selecting the candidate and transfer that to the electorate instead. That these reforms occurred quite recently, and in the wake of these reforms, the political parties have grown substantially weaker. The opening for populist insurgent movements has grown, that we see less expertise, less leadership, less competence in our parties today because our parties have been weakened, that we should move back in the direction of party selection of candidates as opposed to selection via popular primaries, and that we should do things like fund our parties publicly. Finally, and this is right, the repeated theme from all of these works in contemporary political science and political theory, we need to strengthen political parties, party promoting public policy, because political parties are not fixed. They vary with circumstances. If those circumstances strengthen the party can play a more beneficial role. If those circumstances render the parties more accountable to ethical citizens, then ethical citizens can enter a dynamic with their leaders, selecting ethical leaders. And so the suggestion here then is that we need to create circumstances through law that lead parties to be stronger and more ethical, more committed to the common good. You may guess, I'm about to say against this whole raft of contemporary literature, more or less what I said a few minutes ago against Ezra Klein, which is if you're going to propose political reforms, you need to have some viable path for those reforms actually taking hold, actually gaining support, gaining traction, passing. And if those reforms are meant to change the dynamic of your contemporary politics, you need to be able to say why that dynamic won't defeat those reforms. And I have to say, as much as I like many of these ideas, I don't see them succeeding given our current political climate. So let me pause for a minute. I've just thrown a lot of information at you. I've got more ideas, but I want to give you a moment to ask questions to see what you think. Do you want me to keep going? Okay. I can see Flossie's box illuminated. Flossie, were you getting ready to say something? No. then let me continue. And I'm going to move in a somewhat radical direction, and I'm going to do so. Let me skip this for the time being, by returning to the ideas of Karl Marx. And obviously that might strike you as a strange twist, but let me mention that Karl Marx was deeply ambivalent about political parties and representative democracy. There is the position that is famously expressed in the Communist Manifesto, in which Marx says that the communists need a party, that the Communist Party is waiting in the wings, that the Communist Party will be the leading edge of the communist movement, a full embrace of a party that is admittedly for him primarily a revolutionary party, as opposed to a party of electoral democracy. But he did hold out some hope for the idea that in some countries, maybe electoral gains could pave the way to a socialist revolution. But earlier, particularly in an essay called On the Jewish Question, Marx presented what I think of as one of the most interesting and telling critiques of electoral democracy. On the Jewish Question, address the issue, should Jews be given full equal citizenship in Germany, right? And as you know, that's a question with tragic implications. At the time that Marx was writing about this in the early 1840s, of course, it was impossible to anticipate what would happen a century later, but Marx nevertheless pivoted from that question to a broader critique of the intersection of religion and politics. And he suggested, in very short and simplified summary, that something similar was going on in religion and representative democracy. That in religion, humans who are alienated from their society and from their true creative and productive potentials project their intrinsic capacities, their potential, onto an alien being, onto God, in order to be able to see them and to fantasize about realizing them, not in this world, but in another world. And he then moved from that to the idea of representative democracy and suggested that in the modern world, if citizenship is confined simply to voting occasionally in elections for representative officials who then exercise all of the power, we are not genuinely empowered as citizens. And that as opposed to that, we are in fact merely, to echo Rousseau, free long enough to put our chains back on, right? To give the power that is our sovereign power to our representatives. And that when we do that, we tend to project too much of our ambition, too much of our anxiety, too much of our fantasy of empowerment onto our elected officials. That this cultivates and motivates a kind of immaturity, a kind of impatience, a kind of, if you will, magical thinking about politics, in which all we have to do is vote once every few years, and the outcome of that vote will secure for us the power to do whatever we want to do with our politics, with our sovereignty. And the question I have, and it's one that obviously I will have to develop next week with you, is whether or not the pathologies of partisanship that have so paralyzed and distorted American democracy, legislation, political thinking, the response to the coronavirus or climate change, existential threats, whether or not this is all reflective of deeper problems with our democracy that has become essentially only and exclusively a representative form of democracy, not at all a participatory form of democracy. And just to preview for a moment where I'll pick up when we start next week, there is a whole literature I want to just introduce you to. And at some point soon, I hope I'll be able to do a separate lecture series on this literature about alternatives to exclusively representative democracy in
My
the
God.
21st century. And I just want to suggest to you that some of the most interesting and innovative political scientists and philosophers writing today think we are in the grips of a very narrow way of thinking about our politics, whether it is in Iceland or Brazil or New York City. There are alternatives to citizens exclusively exercising their power through voting for representatives. That when we participate more directly in policy consideration and decision making, we tend to become almost immediately much less partisan, much more pragmatic, yet we have very few opportunities to do that. Maybe what we need to do in the 21st century is to cultivate reform that isn't designed to change one party or the other, but is designed to give citizens greater power to actually participate in political decision making, recognizing that there are alternatives and that our current political system is really not working very well for any of us. All right, so now I will stop. Again, I'm happy to take questions, and John has his hand up right away. Bob also has his hand up. John, I'll let
I
you
do, yes.
and Flossie does as well. Go ahead, John.
Thanks. It strikes me as you're talking, it suddenly struck me, as you know, I'm a comparative political scientist. And I was starting to ask you if you think there's any country in the world that has anything we could remotely call a healthy party system. And at the moment, I don't think so. In the UK, Germany, and Japan, there are many problems with the ruling parties, but there's no opposition party in any position. The ruling parties seem to be totally dominating. In France and Italy, the ruling party, the government is a little shakier, but the threat is totally from the right wing, not from the left wing. And I don't know, I don't know enough about Australia or New Zealand to say, but in the what we usually think of the normal democracies, there isn't any place where you could say that party politics is healthy.
Yeah, I thought there might have been some good developments in New Zealand, but I don't follow closely enough to be confident about that. And obviously, we could point to Spain or Greece as other examples of partisan disarray, right? And so the literature here, I'm thinking in particular of Adam Prasarsky's Crises of Democracy. He has some strong arguments that traditional parties are declining, right? Their vote share across the democratic world is going down, and the primary beneficiary of their shrinking share of the vote is right-wing populist insurgent parties. Yeah, so this is a global phenomenon. And Prasarsky points out that a lot of this has to do with economic forces, not political forces, right? This is the fact that the right is better at giving vent to grievances against globalization. And clearly there's a fair bit of that going on in the United States as well. So yes, I agree that this is not an exclusively or narrowly American problem, although I focused primarily on America and literature about America. and that the kinds of solutions that we should be looking for shouldn't be narrowly tailored to our system. Now, having said that, we have federalism, right? We have a variety of peculiar institutions in our electoral system that give these problems a peculiarly American twist. But yes, I actually think that where I'm going at the very end is to say that it's actually countries like Iceland and Ireland and Brazil that have done some of the innovative stuff that are maybe a little bit off our radar in terms of thinking about ordinary politics. Bob, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to express this, but your thoughts about expanding democracy and giving people more participation. I'm thinking of the vaccine situation. Everybody is trying to participate. There are too many different ideas or different ideas about how they should. And if you just leave it to their judgment, where are we?
Yeah, so I'll get into more detail on this next week, right? You might call what you're saying the Madisonian objection, right? That actually, if you filter the ideas of the people through chosen representatives, you'll get more refined, enlarged, likely to succeed, informed by technical expertise, policy proposals. If you let ordinary people try to do this stuff themselves, well, they're not going to give you very good policies. They're not going to have much chance for success. They're going to be motivated by their more narrow sectarian concerns or the kooky stuff that they read on the internet last night, right? And so we need an account institutionally of how we continue to use expertise while also drawing citizens in. And again, just to refer to these texts are filled with ideas about this. We need, at the same time, efforts to enlighten, educate ordinary citizens. And I think one of the things that I take away from Marx is when you limit political participation to voting in a mainly expressive and meaningless exercise once every few years, you don't encourage people to take much time to think very carefully. There's a phrase in contemporary political science, rational apathy and rational ignorance, right? Why should you be much concerned with politics? Get yourself informed about it if you really have a vanishingly small chance to have any real political influence. And so maybe actually giving people a certain amount of political power will also generate the sense of responsibility required for them to use that power effectively.
No,
Flossie, go ahead.
the mail in my box offers me at least 3 different surveys a week. The questions are so idiotic and pro forma. I'm not participating in anything but sending in a check. Now, if my check would help, I'm thinking about how little it took from each of us to get Obama elected. Everybody would put in $5 a month. It came out to $25 a month. And somehow we got Obama elected despite the money that the Republicans offered to their candidate. What I'm faced with now is how much does our check, whether it's 25 or 50 or 100, what can it do against the powerful organizations, some of them pretending to be nonprofit, that support the Republicans? this New Yorker, the present issue by Jane Meyer is frightening. I mean, it isn't only the Heritage Foundation. It's also the fact that the Supreme Court has given people, not of my persuasion, the power to soak so much money into funding a man like Trump. And where he gets his power from is the money bags. Some of the Republicans need his, not so much his power, but his money or his designation that some of his personal friends should support those who support him. We're up against so much money. What can my surveys and my little checks do? I want to participate. I would like the idea to help, but how?
So this is the article, Floss.
Yes, you got it. Yeah, it's scary.
I haven't read it yet. It's
Oh,
open.
but
on my,
read it and
read
get
table.
scared. Yeah.
It just came in yesterday's mail with the lovely dog cover for those of you who are New Yorkers fans. But Jane Mayer, who's done this wonderful work, Dark Money, on the sources that fund primarily conservative politics in the United States, has another big, interesting article, it looks like, on the sources that are funding the big lie that the election was stolen by Biden. And I want to be careful here, Flossie. I've got a few different things to say. One of them is, based on what I'm reading, Trump has raised over $100 million since leaving office and spent almost none of it on anything other than his own legal fees. Right?
Yes, yeah, I know that.
And so it's not Trump per se who was funding this, but it's other political opportunists who see the advantage in promoting the lie that Trump won this election, that it was stolen from him, because that will allow them
but the money is out there.
Oh yeah, no, the money is out there, absolutely, and it is large, and it is concerted, and it is coordinated, it is sophisticated in its operation, and it is pulling the wool over the eyes of a substantial portion of the electorate, and it's amplified by social media, right? And so yes, even if it's not Trump per se in this particular case, the idea that money is the cancer of our politics, I think is absolutely correct. And Jane Mayer has been one of the best journalists at documenting the money trail and what the money is doing. Now, Flossie raises a second question. What, if anything, can we do through small contributions to counter this? And it's worthwhile remembering, I believe it's 240 individuals furnish more than half of the money in American politics. So yes, there are limits on what we can do, right? And Flossie, those surveys don't do anything. They're just a gimmick to get you to feel like you're empowered enough that you'll write a check, right? Yeah. Just to be clear. But having said that, should you write those checks? And I want to say, probably yes, unfortunately, right? You use the example of Obama and how he bundled a whole bunch of small contributions and became, in fact, an economically viable candidate. I do want you to remember that Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump considerably, right? And so we do at points reach a saturation point in American politics. It's not as if our elections are simply bought and sold, although they are clearly, deeply distorted by the influence of the donor class on who is viable and who is excluded from politics. But let's just remember, I'll take Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as an example. We do get left-wing as well as right-wing insurgent politics. We do occasionally swim against the tide of money, and small contributions do help. But then I guess I would suggest to you, you need to be careful, assuming you don't have limitless amounts of money, who you give those small contributions to. And the people who are sending you mass mailers and who are asking you to participate in surveys, they already have the resources to do that. I think you need to scrutinize carefully what would the additional increment of money that you would give them do for them as opposed to for somebody else. I've already mentioned the idea of funding moderate Republicans as a way of funding reform in the Republican Party. I just think we that would be an example, or funding a city council person who you think might do something about policing or pollution or some other issue that you care about. That sometimes our contributions have larger impacts when we look away from national politics and the large organizations that lobby and campaign, and instead look at those places that are a little bit out of the limelight, but where, for precisely that reason, a $25 contribution might actually make.
Yes, you're right. And I'm thinking of the attempt to recall Gavin Newsom in California.
Yeah. All right, everybody.
Uh,
Wonderful spending another Saturday morning with you. Please do continue being safe and taking care of yourselves. I'm glad to hear everything is all right there. Unfortunately, as much as we want this all to be over, it isn't. And in fact, the new variant of the virus, as you're painfully aware, is more contagious, more dangerous. We have to keep being careful. So take care of yourselves. I'll see you next week. Great as always spending Saturday morning with you. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.